Right, well, hello and welcome to another episode of Retropower Uncut. And we're starting outside this week, and I'm starting this week instead of Cal because we've switched things around. So, yeah, here we are with a very purple new arrival of the sister car to Project 1, which is the next Mark 1 Escort build. We brought it in slightly early just to help us with a couple of things on the other one, a couple of dimensional checks and clarifications, and also so that we can make a start on this while we're awaiting for various bits that we need to finish the body shell on the other one. So yeah, here it is. Interestingly for viewers, it's a Mark 1 Escort obviously, but interestingly for viewers, would be interested for any information. This was built in, according to the VIN tag, this was built in December 1974, which makes it an extremely late Mark 1 Escort, because December 1974 was when Mark 2 Escort production commenced at Halewood. So be interested to know what the sort of history on that is, and whether there was any overlap, whether there were any last of the line Mark 1s that actually overlapped in terms of VINs to Mark 2s, or whether there was a definite sequence to that. Just whether anybody has any further information or any later VIN tagged than that Mark 1 Escorts, but certainly it's a very, very last of the line Mark 1. Which is interesting and probably makes it slightly unusual, but nonetheless it will be going into the project and metal zone soon. We've noticed going around it, it looked a reasonably original car, but yeah, the further you look at it, the less original it looks, so no surprises there. We're intrigued by the fact that the rear vent, the rear deck panel here, the slots in here don't go all the way through. We thought we'd got something really unusual there, then realised that yeah, the expressed panels, aftermarket panel version of this, they're not punched all the way through. They're pressed but not punched, not cut through. So that's probably been replaced, and once that's been replaced, then goodness knows what else has been replaced, because that's not exactly the primary rot spot for a Mark 1. So I'm sure we'll find all sorts of interesting things on this once we get it blasted. So watch this space on this. The roof looks like it could do with being made new as a quick glance. And I'm guessing the quarters are going to need to be new, and all the front end will need to be new because they always do. So yeah, I imagine it'll be fairly typical in terms of not having much original metal in it by the time it's all good. So yeah, we'll see how that one progresses. We'll march on indoors, and I'll let Jamie through the door so he doesn't get trapped. And we are then going to move over. I'm checking my script here because Jamie's got a sequence that we kind of need to follow. And we'll start. I'm going to start at the front of this, if that's all right with you, Jamie, and then we'll move back. But starting at the front, Stu had done. I'm going to put my coffee down, actually. I know that sounds a crazy thing to do, but I'm actually going to put my coffee down and that down. We saw this, I think we saw this corner last week. Yeah, this is this corner. We saw this last week. So again, just to show it again for people who didn't see last week, that's a corner for the front wing. Easy enough to make-ish, reasonably. Stu won't like me saying that, but you know, it's a relatively simple shape panel. Hard to get to the exact shape you want, but not too tricky to shape. So that's that corner. Obviously, you've seen the middle section. Now, when it comes to, this is a sort of technical aside in this week's Uncut ramble from me, but when you've got one side done, if you haven't got a book to make the other side too, you need to make an accurate copy of that. There's quite a cool way of doing it, which is what Stu's done on this, which is to make what's called a flexible shape pattern. We unashamedly stole the idea for doing that, and I'm sure maybe somebody else had it before him, but he does some very good tutorials on YouTube of it. Ray Schelin, W-R-A-Y, Ray Schelin, S-C-H-E-L-I-N, in the States. Very good metal shaper that we follow and get a lot of tips and tricks from. And he talks about making flexible shape patterns. Watch his videos, but basically you make a crosshatch mesh of tape, preferably fiberglass tape, so that it has a zero stretch to it, but masking tape works reasonably well. You lay that up over this in a crosshatch so that it is rigid in all directions, it has no stretch. And you peel it off, dust all the adhesive on it with some dust so that it won't stick to things, and then you can actually pop that shape pattern inside out and then use it the other side. And it actually tells you, because it maintains its shape so accurately, it will tell you whether you have the shape of your matching panel for the other side, which is lurking under here. It will actually tell you whether you have the opposite hand panel the same shape because the shape pattern will go slack on any areas that don't have enough crown and loose on the edges if you've got too much crown. So it gives you a really very, very accurate indication of shape where you don't really want to have to start creating a book for the part. And if you make that flexible shape pattern very accurate to the edges of the panel that you've made, then it will give you that shape extremely accurately because it will be relative to the edges. So very, very good little tip. But yeah, make flexible shape pattern, very easy way to replicate, a very easy and cheap and quick way, should I say, to replicate with fair accuracy a panel from one side of a car to another, or to copy a panel from a car. If you need to make a new panel and you have one that you can copy, you can make the flexible shape pattern, peel it off and use that to give you the guide for the panel that you're trying to make without having to make a full book, and it gets you pretty damn close to correct. So that's that. So that was where Stu started the week, and then moving on to round the back, you'll notice that we now have a wheel, and the wheel is attached to a rear subframe, which is an independent rear end. I think we've mentioned it before. It's got an S-type Jaguar rear end, but converted to outboard brake type hub carrier. Basically, X300 Jaguar XJ hub carrier assembly and quill shaft in the end, or stub shaft in the end, connected to the remainder of the assembly from, I couldn't tell you what year, but the original old S-type Jaguar subframe assembly. And then those in the know will realise that the universal joints on the early type Jaguar IRS are of a different dimension to the universal joints on the XJ40 and onwards type hub carrier. And there are a number of ways around that, but they generally involve custom drive shafts. Obviously on the XJ, you can use facelift XJS type assembly, and then the parts all match. But on these, the drive shafts are unique to the earlier car, to the S-type, to make them the correct length for the Mark II Jaguar. And at that point, you're stuck with two different UJ sizes between the stub shaft that's in the hub and the actual drive shaft that attaches to it. So the solution to that is an unequal UJ, which we've sourced via Dave Mac Props, John at Dave Mac Props, who's our prop shaft supplier. So he's sourced us the universal joints with the unequal bearing. Basically, the spider is of two different widths across the two bearings involved, so that it can combine the drive stub from the X300 XJ to the early type S-type drive shaft, if that makes any sense at all to anybody. Basically, it means that we can then run the outboard brake setup, outboard hub carrier, and just a generally more modern setup in terms of brakes, but still use the original Jag type IRS, which it suits the car and uses the power lock type diff and etc, etc. So it should, and also fits in the body shell reasonably readily. So then, once we've done that, Stu's got the rear frame jig made now, which is bolted to the back of the select jig now to hold the rear frame in the correct location with the axle centre line in the correct location, square to the jig, square to the car, and he can now fabricate the rail sections that will pick up the rear rubber mounts that carry that rear subframe in the car, and then he can fabricate the radius arm mounts and continue from there. So yeah, good progress on getting the rear suspension in. Once he's done that, then he can progress onto the rear bodywork. But obviously he needed to do the rear suspension first because the structure that carries that rear suspension also carries the back of the car, so it kind of needs to go in first. So yeah, that's where we're at on Churchill. I'm going to wander this way, pick up my list just in case I need a memory jog, which I don't think I do. We're going to swing by here now via Camaro. I'm going to pronounce it the American way. And we're going to stop by the Camaro. Tom's been working on this. We had a problem which we talked about, we mentioned last week, where we'd had a bit of a battle with the back edge of the front wings not matching the doors. They didn't match originally. They're an aftermarket panel problem, as usual, with wings not matching doors. The problem is they'd been adjusted once when the car was first. They were the original, well, they weren't the original wings. They were the wings that were on the car when it came to the UK from the USA, and it had been restored, in inverted commas, in the USA. Now, I should point out, we may have mentioned this before, I can't remember, probably have going back a long way. The car had been restored in the USA. The only piece of the car that hasn't needed replacement following that extensive restoration is basically the inside structure of the body tub, the inner quarters, the inner rear bulkhead and the inner sills, and part of the inner part of the front bulkhead and the dash. And that's about the only original metal in the car. Such was the quality of the original restoration. However, moving on from that, one of the external parts we had reused was the original outer front wings. However, they'd been adjusted quite a lot to the previous doors. We've had to replace the doors because the originals were rusty, and then done the modifications to the front of the car, and then had to adjust the back edge of the wings again, which basically meant that they'd got to the stage where they were beyond any further adjustment. They'd had edges built up with weld, edges refolded in so many different places that we just couldn't get them good enough. So what we've done is cut the back edge completely off the original front wings. Step back from that slightly, rewind very slightly. One solution would have been to buy new front wings. However, given that these were aftermarket front wings and they didn't fit properly, we concluded there was quite a good chance of ordering wings from the States, waiting for them to arrive, getting them to the car and finding they didn't fit and having to modify them and not really solving a problem, having spent quite a lot of money on wings. So what we've concluded is we would cut the back edge off the existing wings and refabricate it so that it was correct to the doors, which Tom's pretty much done now. There's a couple of minor adjustments needed now on the very bottom of this side, but he's pretty much rebuilt the back edge of both wings and got them both now fitted accurately to the doors and all the front of the car fitted up and everything aligned. So yeah, hopefully by the end of play today, we should be done. And then this will be ready to go back into the body shop and have the final stages done. Obviously it's going to need, most of the back end of the car was all aligned and prepped and blocked and pretty much getting there, but the front part and the wing to door prep is going to need to be revisited, and all the other prep and alignment around the front will need to be re-gone over now we've got the wing adjustments done. So that's where we're at on Camaro. Moving on from that, just checking my list now, because we've got Camaro, yes, Camaro's there. Right, we're going to go on to Project 1 via a scrap Escort wing. The beginning of my week on the Escort started with having another little check with a fresh head and fresh eyes at the front wing not fitting scenario on the Escort. Interestingly, I've had a look at photographs and video from a couple of other Escort restorers, just trying to sanity check the bits I didn't think fitted very well, and they've pretty much confirmed my suspicions. The front wings don't match the doors, that's pretty much seems to be the rule, and that the ends of the scuttle are not the right shape. Looking elsewhere seems to confirm that problem as well. And then interestingly, so I'd come to that conclusion at the beginning of the week, and we've decided to park the front wing fit for the minute. Magnum are supposed to be getting some more bubble arch front wings in stock and some more standard front wings in stock in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So what we're going to do is hold fire until we can get some bubble arch front wings, because although we're not using standard bubble arches, the bubble arch front wings are actually quite close to the shape we want. Not there, but they're quite close. So we're going to try and see if those are a better fit than the standard type wings. And rather than grafting a modified bubble arch into the standard wing, we might try modifying the bubble arch, if that makes sense. So anyway, we're going to park that problem for now. But interestingly, fetching the Escort that you've just seen a few minutes ago, when that's come, that came with a couple of replacement panels. Now the panels are no good. These have been acid dipped and they've rotted away at the back and they're not in very good condition. But interestingly, and I think it is, well, I'm sure it is also an aftermarket wing. However, interestingly, I tried this on here and this does match the door profile. So this is a different pressing to the pressings that we've got. The flanges are quite different on these, and interestingly, this does almost perfectly match the door profile and does sit correctly. So it kind of backs up the theory that the problem lies with the wings, not anything else. So the scuttle is still wrong on the ends, but this wing definitely matches the door a lot better. So that's why that's leaning up there. We've had a little, I just wanted to go over that area again and try and get straight in my head that I hadn't done anything silly. But that pretty much confirms, as far as I can tell, that no, nothing silly's happened, they just don't fit. So that's where we're at with that. And then following that, I've moved on a bit, leaving So Tom's been working on the Camaro this week. I want to leave him some more panel work to get on with, the roof and the gutters and that side of things, and some more work on the back end of the car. So I've stepped away from that for a bit so that to leave him that work while I get on with the rear suspension work. So I'll come over here. My laptop obviously will have gone to sleep now. But yeah, I've just been, obviously, though people familiar with the project will realise that the rear suspension is heavily based on the suspension assembly that I did for Gordon Murray's car. However, there are two, not too big, but reasonable issues with that. One is I never drew the entire suspension assembly for Gordon's car on CAD. I made a lot of it on the workbench using the parts. I didn't have drawings, I didn't have a 3D scanner at the time. There were lots of things I didn't have at the time I did that I do have now. And in fact, interestingly, Gordon's car was I'd only just started using Fusion. The first thing I ever drew in Fusion was the rear diff, the billet diff cover for the first iteration of the suspension that was fitted to Gordon's car. That was the first part I ever drew in Fusion. So this is sort of like winding back the clock a little bit, but I never drew the full assembly in Fusion or in CAD at all. I drew various parts of it, but I never drew the full assembly. And furthermore, when we added the rubber bushings to the diff mountings, originally the diff on Gordon's car was solid mounted, and it was actually a structural part of the rear assembly. Now, that transmitted differential noise, and whatever we did with diffs, and we'd swap the diffs over, and we ran a worn standard Ford one, and a brand new build one, and one set to tight backlash, one set to loose backlash. We played around with it a lot, and whatever we did, there was still too much noise transmission through the car. Not horrendous, but more than you want for a road car that wants to be nice and refined. So we concluded that I needed to rubber mount the diff, which I did, which removed it from the structure, which meant I had to revise the structure. And I have no drawings, and I don't even really have any photographs of that. I've got it in my head, but that's about it, because it was kind of done to fit in with the space I had available at the time. So what I'm doing now is turning all of that stuff that's in my head and in separate discrete drawings of individual parts, like, for example, on here, this bit I call the bat wing, this section here, which carries these two tubes, and this picks up a pair of bushes which carry the two bushes which mount into fabricated sections in here, which carry the torsional loading from the diff. That bit was drawn individually, and I draw the little spacer tubes individually, and I drew the plates which are fabricated into this frame individually, but I never actually drew it all as an assembly. I just drew the bits as I needed them so I could cut them out on our CNC plasma cutter. So what I'm doing now is incorporating them all into one drawing so that I can put it all together, tie all the dimensions together, and make sure it's all together in one place. I could probably not do that, but I think given that I've got two cars to build both with this assembly in, it's probably valuable enough to be worth doing this and getting it all in CAD so that I don't make mistakes, because time spent now in CAD is time saved later trying to work out where a mistake's happened in the fabricated parts while you're trying to fit them to the car. So that's why we're doing that. So that's what I'm currently working on, and also then getting pieces into play in terms of, there's a lot of machined turned parts involved in this. There's quite a lot of bits that aren't shown yet. I'm probably only 30% of the way through drawing the assembly at the moment, maybe not even that. And there's probably, well, so far there's about 24 turned parts, lathe machined, as in turned on a lathe parts that I need for that assembly. So I'm just getting all of those listed, working out which parts I'm going to turn here, which parts I'm going to subcontract to turn, so that I can get on with the fabrication while somebody else is machining. And we could machine them all in-house, but we're pretty busy. And James and I are probably the two people who are most proficient on the lathe, and both of us have got lots of other things to do. So at the moment it's a case of trying to balance what I need to turn now so I can get on, and then what I can send out for turning elsewhere at one of our subcontractors to speed the process along and mean I can get on with work that I can't send out, the actual fabrication. So following the getting the sequencing of parts out to machining and machining parts here, I'm going to start doing the sub-assembly fabrications. I'll build the wishbone jig, fabricate the wishbones, build the rear frame jig, build the rear frames, Start getting all those bits together, and also and I will also, in tandem with that, draw up the location jig to be able to locate that whole sub-assembly into the back of the car on the select jig. And the plan there is there'll be a sub-assembly jig that bolts to that lot, bolts to the bed frame on that you can slide under, and that'll give us the axle centre line correct, square to the rest of the car, and make it easy, make it hard to get it wrong, basically. It's very easy. If you're trying to just line things up manually underneath the car, it's very easy to get it wrong. So if we have a jig that bolts down, just like Stu has made for under the back of the Churchill Jaguar, it means that everything's held to the jig bed, can't move, nothing goes wrong, and you know that you've got everything welded in the right place, and you don't come back to it and discover something's moved. So yeah, so that's where we're at on Escort. And I guess moving on from that, we go to, making sure I haven't missed anything, yeah, we're going to go to, I'm going to bring my coffee as well, we're going to go into the body shop and have a quick look at the Opel Manta in here, which is currently being bedecked with its Manta 400 wheel arches, and will be imminently looking at things, will be imminently being fitted with its three-piece spoiler. So yeah, Gaz and Steve are cracking on with this. I think Mark may have been doing earlier as well. And they've been getting the flatting and polishing work done on the body. They've got all that flatted and polished. They've then put the black paint around the window apertures that's got to be done, that has to be added before the windows are fitted, but can't be done until after the flatting and polishing is done, so you don't ruin the black finish. So yeah, that's all coming together quite well now. I think they've got a few looking at this, they've got the trims to paint, all of the trims. There's a lot of very, very bendy, very, very flimsy bits of aluminium on an Opel Manta that surround all the surround the window apertures, and they're very difficult. They're unavailable new, very difficult to get off the car intact, but we have now pieced together a set that are all good, intact, unbent, and good enough to go back on the car. So yeah, they've all got to get painted as well now. So yeah, the good progress on the Manta. It's been a job we've kind of left for a little while, because there's no point doing too much flatting and polishing until you're a little bit near a mechanical assembly complete, because inevitably, with a lot of leaning over the car, the marks do get put on it. Not major ones, but you know, little scuffs that need to be polished out do get put in the lacquer. Interestingly, I'll pick up on I see a lot of comments, most weeks in fact, from people saying that we're working on cars without wing protectors on. Yes, we are, and we do it for a good reason. There's a double-edged sword, a wing protector. It's very, very easy to lull yourself into a false sense of security. If you put protection around a car, it's very easy to lull yourself into a false sense of security and think that the car's protected, and then somehow take less care. And at that point, that's when you're going to damage the car, because you'll touch part of it you thought was protected and damage it, or your protector will move, and then the worst thing of all is the protector traps some dirt under it, nobody notices it, you're leaning over the protector, and the protector's merrily rubbing a piece of swarf, a bit of stone, a bit of grit or something into the paintwork, and engraving a hole through your paint without you even realising. Whereas if you just wear reasonably clean clothes, keep them dusted, don't wear big buckles, he says, looking down and seeing his buckle, but I'm not working on painted cars, so that's all right. Basically, don't wear big buckles, don't wear loads of jewellery, and make sure that you're relatively clean when you're leaning over cars. You don't actually tend to damage the paintwork. I can't actually think of a time recently. I can think of one occasion once where one of our employees damaged the car leaning over a wing. But generally, I don't think I can recall any. It was a fiberglass one, and he did have a reasonable weight, being blunt. But generally, I can't think of any occasions where leaning over the front wing of a car working on it in our assembly shop that we've damaged that wing. Whereas I do know of occasions where having a wing protector on, damage has been done underneath the wing protector. So that's why we don't use them. It's a deliberate decision, and it's not just ignorance on our part. We deliberately don't use them. So just to answer that one, because I see that come up quite a lot. So moving on from that, we will wander around to the paint booth, because I'm just trying to think whether the lights are on in the paint booth at the minute. Can you just switch them on, guys? Yeah, we will move on to the paint booth, because I'm going to hand over to Cal at the point of, I can't actually open it. I will point through the door, point through the cracked glass. We need to replace the glass in these doors at some point, at painted Land Cruiser parts in there. And that alludes to a little bit of footage from Jamie and a bit of a surprise next door. At that point, I will hand over to Cal.
Well, thank you very much, Nat. It's extremely unusual that I haven't started the video, but it seemed logical to do it the other way today so we could get that lovely montage of the paintwork being done on this Land Cruiser body. So I've no doubt the longer term followers will be pleased we haven't painted it purple like the Morris, and hopefully you'll be liking the fetching shade of hearing aid beige that we've done it. I love it actually. I think it looks superb. So on this, because we're doing a sort of utilitarian sort of theme to it, we've done the inside with Raptor with quite a heavy texture to it. Gaz spent quite a long while honing his technique to get that texture, and then the outside, my hope was that he would get it pretty good from the gun, so we didn't have to flat and polish it, so it wasn't too show car-y, and I would say he's absolutely nailed it, to be fair. It's definitely the upper end of what you'd expect on a OEM car, so really happy with that. We're just going to, if there's any little bits in it, we'll nib them out, but to be honest, I haven't really seen any, so top job on that, and looking forward now to getting onto the build with this. So Adam and I had a bit of a meeting on various cars, as we tend to do when we're forward planning the next steps on things, mainly focusing on this, the Mustang and the Morris earlier this week. And there's quite a lot we can crack on with this. We've got a little bit of a wait on the engine still. We're still waiting for the block and heads back, although as soon as they're back we can crack on. James has made a start on the axles, so he's basically cleaning out threads, cleaning out casings, reuniting all of the Xylan coated parts with the powder coated casing parts, and getting ready to get everything back together axle wise. He's also been on with the transmission. We're using a 80 series fully mechanical automatic transmission. It's the A440F transmission, which you probably remember if you followed us for a while, that we chose because there's no electronics on it. It's completely standalone. You can run it without having to interface with the engine management at all. So we'll be running Motec engine management, and then the transmission is just self-contained, runs itself essentially. Now we're having that rebuilt by, I think it's Midland Automatic Transmissions in Kettering, who have done a great job on some auto transmissions for us previously. But as with most instances where we send things out to people like transmission rebuild companies, we like to keep in control of the cosmetic side of things, because they're generally just rebuilding stuff for day-to-day vehicles. Obviously the level of detail on the cosmetics doesn't tend to be a massive concern to them normally. So what we normally do is get those companies to strip everything down, give us back the casing and any external fasteners, and then we deal with the cosmetic side of that, then give them back to them to do the actual mechanical rebuild. So at the moment on that trolley over there is the casing from the auto transmission. We've bead blasted that, and then we've just been meticulously cleaning out all of the oil ways everywhere on it, make sure there's absolutely no bead left anywhere in it. So that's about ready to go. There's a steel part to that casing which I think is being blasted at the minute, and then once all those bits are cleaned and all the fasteners, nuts, bolts, etc. have been zinc plated, all of that lot will go back over to the transmission place. They'll carry out the mechanical rebuild, and we'll get the whole lot back in one go. And I think timing wise, hopefully that will coincide quite well with the engine build being complete. And then the idea is we'll get all of that then in the chassis, axles will be built by then, get them on as well. And basically we'll lead up to having a rolling chassis that we can put this body straight onto. In the meantime, there's quite a lot we can get on with on the body itself. We were talking about this, and we can get anything that's behind the dash together now. So the heater unit goes in there. All of these switches can go in, the climate control controls, we can put in the steering column, pedal box. We've done everything to allow it to be fairly modular. So all of the wiring, in fact, on the body goes to bulkhead connectors here. So everything disconnects from the bulkhead. So in reality, we can do all of the body side of things, plonk the body on, and then just connect up for the other half. So we're going to crack on with a lot of that. We've got a few parts coming in as well now, so some of the things we've had machined. I was talking about the heater, so there's a blower unit. We're using a vintage air heater unit, which is hidden up under here. But the fan part of that, we wanted to keep in the original location, which is on the engine bay side of the bulkhead, because it intakes through the little louvers. There's some this side, but there's that side as well, air intake through there and then through the bulkhead. So what we've decided to do was keep the original Land Cruiser fan housing, but we wanted to put a more modern fan, and given that we bought the whole vintage air unit, it made sense for us to use the vintage air fan. So we've machined a new top capping for that original Land Cruiser blower housing that then allows us to mount the vintage air fan inside it, because it's the perfect size in terms of the actual fan itself to fit in that original housing. So that's come back from machining. Another thing we had back from machining was the mounting for an idler pulley. that's going to replace the power steering pump on the engine. So because we've now got an electric power steering column going into this, the hydraulic power steering pump on the engine is redundant, but obviously the belt train still needs to go around something, and you can't just run the pump dry. So we've done a machined piece that bolts onto the engine there and has an idler pulley on the end of it to replace the power steering pump. So that's come back from machining. And then we had a whole batch of things that were previously machined back from anodizing. So the bezel plate that goes around the gear shifters, the check strap mounts, the pieces we had made to protect the rear lamps, they're all back from anodizing. The knobs that go on here, on these switches, they've come back from anodizing. They're now going to go off to be laser engraved with the logos for their functions, which will be on the actual knob itself. So we've got a lot of parts coming in to try and get all the pieces of the puzzle to come together at the same time. But that'll allow us to get quite a lot of this done. So we'll get that heater unit in there, get the blower fan on, get all these switch gear in here, and we'll kind of get this built up as much as we can. Another thing we've got to do is design the fuel tanks. That'll probably be one of the next jobs, is going to be 3D scanning these apertures here and doing a CAD drawing for these fuel tanks so we can get those fabricated, which actually ties in a little bit with the Morris, because we've done the drawing previously for the Morris fuel tank. We were about to send that off. We're just doing the final checks to make sure we've not made any mistakes. And Adam actually made a valid point that he was a little bit concerned over whether the tank would actually fit through the boot aperture to get to its final location. So he's just been cutting out a 2D template in wood, I think it was, to see if we could actually get it at the right angle to fit it in. I think it's proving to be okay, but we're just going through the final checks so we can send that drawing off. John's been working on the Morris as well. He's been running the battery cable, which is running down the sill. The same with the main wiring loom will run down the sill on the other side. We put holes at the front and back of the sills at the Metalwork stage to run that wiring through. And conveniently, where there's those big punched holes on the outside of the sill, which eventually get covered with a cover plate, that allows us to get in with A, to feed the cable through more easily, but B, we can get in with an Allen key to do up bolts in there, so we can actually put cable clips down the inside of the sill, inside the sill aperture. Whereas normally if you wanted to run a cable down the sill, it's just got to sort of sit in there because you can't get inside there to hold it in any way. So it's quite nice that they're there. George is just on with the mock-up fit-up of the doors. So we've got so many new components, the exterior handles, all the pivot mechanism that holds the handle, the cranks that operate the central locking motor up to the lock mechanism. They're all newly designed components. The glass is new because it's now not got the quarter light anymore. There's so many new things in there. I wanted to do one more final fit up of everything with every rubber seal, etc. in place before we pull the trigger on a few of the machining jobs. So the machining of all the components of the door lock that I just talked about, and also the little triangle at the front of the door where the mirror attaches. That's another bespoke part. So I just want to check all of those before they get machined. So he's about to be swearing at that door frame in a minute, I imagine. We've left them unpainted at the minute for the same reason, that I wanted to just be sure all the holes and things were drilled in them correctly before we painted them. But yeah, that's the next step on that. George has also been scanning the dash in that. So originally there's like a little glove box cubby hole in that big aperture on each side of the dash, 2 of them. Now there's so much stuff behind the dash on this one. There's vintage air heater AC unit on the near side, all the brake and clutch master cylinders on the off side, that there's no reason for those to be able to open anymore. So they don't need the handles on. They're also quite small. There's quite a lot of gap around them. We don't want the chrome beading that used to sit around them. And the hinges sit into a recess at the bottom. And because we don't want the hinges there, the recess would then look out of place. So it all added up to actually making new pieces to go in there. So we're 3D scanning that so we can then machine some new inserts that actually are just fixed in there. They slot in and clip into place, but don't hinge, so they don't have any of those redundant details on. So we're doing a 3D scan for that. That sort of leads on to another 3D scanning job which we got out of the way this week, was on the Jensen. So you saw Rich last week was glassing that aperture we'd made for the roof into the Jensen body shell, which is where we're going to have a custom-made glass roof panel that sits into that. Now, we designed the CAD model for the glass panel, and the tooling that we made the aperture for the roof from, all from the same model. So in theory, it should all fit perfectly. But we're so paranoid about it because obviously A, the carbon body is going to be very expensive, and B, the tooling to do the glass panels very expensive. So we decided we'd do a triple check on it, and now the aperture is moulded into the body itself. We decided we'd scan that again, put that into CAD, and get the glass panel in CAD and just check the fit again, just to make sure that that aperture hadn't twisted at all when it was actually moulded into the body. Now it shouldn't have done because we've made a tool to clamp all the body in place whilst it was being attached. But there was still a little niggle there. We've got the opportunity to do a triple check on it, and so we might as well. And that went really well. It looks absolutely spot on in CAD. The line of the roof flows perfectly. And that was another little slight concern at the back of our mind, is that we designed the tooling and the glass from a scan of a non-sunroof car that we did. And we just don't know how much variation there was between one body and another. And I had this vision of it getting the glass panel and there being like a nice flowing line to the roof, and then a totally different curve to the glass, and then a nice flowing line again. But it does look spot on in the CAD. It flows really nicely all the way through. So that was pleasing to see. So we're going to pull the trigger on getting the glass made for that now. And Rich was just finishing off the very back edge. There was because of the size of the aperture we were making and the size of the cutout for the original sunroof, there was a small gap that needed basically clamping in place and glassing and smoothing out, which is what Rich has been working on last week. So that's that. Mustang, as I said, Adam and I had a good old chat through the remaining work on this week, and actually I was pleasantly surprised how little there is. Well, that's stupid of me to say that and tempt fate, but it's not looking too bad. The biggest remaining thing really is the wiring. Interior is starting to go together now. Adam's been working on some of that. He's finished vinyling that parcel shelf. He's done a vinyl on the A-pillars. That looks really nice. We've got a vinyl that's got a texture which matches the new quarter trim and door cards quite well. So that all ties together really nicely. He's done the boot seal and is just about to start on the door seals, I think. And actually at that point, we're more or less in a position to get the quarter trims and the door panels in. I think the only stumbling block on that is that we hadn't realised, although the owner had ordered most of the seals for the car, the belt trims, or belt seals I think they call them, which sit along the bottom of the glass on the doors and the rear quarters. We had a box with those in, but we'd never opened it. We'd just ticked it off as being here. And then when we actually went to open it, they're fastback ones, which don't include the rear quarter lights. So we've got a new set of those coming so we can finish that. And that's really the last part to allow us to finish the door builds. And then it's pretty much on to finishing the wiring and then getting the rest of the interior in. It was nice to do some finishing off jobs at the front, so the Ford lettering's on now, and the little bezels that go around the bonnet pins, and the trim at the front of the bonnet, sorry, which is the top of the grille. So the front end's looking really complete on it, which is pretty cool. And then front bumper's only not on because we're waiting on an order from Summit Racing, which they've got the bumper irons. The bumper irons are on that order, they've got them. But another thing on the order is the instrument panel, which is not in stock yet, but I think we're only a couple of weeks away from having that now. The Dakota Digital instrument panel that's going in it. So as soon as that's here, then we'll be able to put the front bumper on. So that's where we're at with that. Clipper, John's doing a bit more work on that. He's just doing the battery, which is being mounted in the spare wheel well. We've been doing finalising the brake conversion, so it's got Audi S2 calipers on the front with Corrado G60 discs. We've done a trial fit of that, that'll look great. He's finished the brake plumbing now. So things are progressing okay on that. I think the next thing on that is going to be the dreaded soft top hood, which I think Adam's going to do, which he's not overly looking forward to, but there's quite a lot of components in that soft top assembly, and we're doing a total refit, so it's new outer skin, new headlining, and then the new insulation pad inside as well. So yeah, it's going to no doubt be one of those jobs there's a lot of swearing involved. So that's that. And on the subject of Golfs, there's a Mark II here. Really, really nice example. We did the body shell restoration on this, I think it was 6 years ago, owned by a local chap. it's back here. It's been booked in for a while actually, but it's come back because the doors had got some blistering coming through on them. They were the original doors, which when we did the work 6 years ago were in pretty good condition, but a few blisters started to come through on those. So he'd managed to source some new old stock VW doors. So we've just been painting those. Gaz is literally halfway through refitting the doors and getting all that lot together. Then we're going to give it a bit of a machine polish and a freshen up, and that's going to be back to him to enjoy for the summer. But he's done a really nice job of the build on that, I have to say. It's just subtle and how I see a Mark II Golf should be. I like they are BBS RAs, I think. I love the way they look on the car. It's got the interior that I would probably have in that car as well. So yeah, not a bad machine. And on that note, I normally hand over to Nat, but this time, no, because he did the first bit. So no handover to Nat. We'll just see you next week.